Working with double cloth is not as difficult as one might think. These here are the examples we're going to be making in this lesson. So the first is the classic double cloth seam, followed up by the inset seam, a couple of edge finishes. This is the classic double cloth edge finish. We follow that up with what appears to be a bound edge. And finally, double cloth sewn with a bullion stitch. As I said, they look a lot more complicated than they really are, so let's get busy. Double cloth is exactly what the name implies. It is a fabric composed of two different cloths, and these are either bonded together with a fusible web or they're actually woven together in the weaving process. So one reason for double cloth is that you could have two different fabrics. You could have a solid and a plaid, or you could have two different colors, or you could have something like this. This is what's called a double crepe. Now it appears to be just a crepe, but if you look at it, again, it's two different fabrics. It gives the fabric a little different hang. Now there are specific techniques that you want to use on double cloth, because the beauty of double cloth is that you can make unlined garments. We will cover that. We've got a lot of work to do, so let's get busy. This is called the classic double cloth seam. It looks like a seam from both sides. Now, if you let the light play across it, you can see that you have thickness on this side and thickness on this side. That's because you're dealing with the seam allowances of both layers of fabric. It looks pretty much the same from both sides, and the bulk is balanced evenly. That is what we're going to achieve in the next lesson, the classic double cloth seam. Before we sew, there is marking and splitting the layers. Now I'm going to assume for all of these examples here that we're working with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So to begin, you can see here I've drawn a chalk mark here, and I will draw a chalk mark here, 1 1/8 inches away from the cut edge. That's 2 times the seam allowance, plus 1/8 of an inch just for turn of cloth. So now that these are marked, you want to take a contrast basting thread to mark this. See, where we're going with this, just to explain why, is you want to split the fabrics to this line. So marking with basting will help you to see when you have split the fabric far enough. Obviously, this will all come out later. So this is marking going forward. Next, splitting. Now I've worked ahead on this one. And whenever I say in the rest of the lesson, split the fabric, this is what we'll be doing. As you can see here, there's our chalk line that we drew and our thread basting. And I have come in and cut all of the threads that hold the two layers together. Now I've seen double-sided fabrics that are fused. That's much easier to split. But again, it's not the same as this. So this is where we're going. And this is how we get there. I'm going to show you quite a bit of this process because it is painstaking. To give you kind of an idea of time you're going to spend, last time I made a jacket, it was 36 inches took me about 45 minutes. So it's painstaking, it's tedious. You want to have good scissors. And you just have to be careful because you could actually cut a hole into the fabric if you're not just cutting the threads that bind. Now this one here, this particular fabric, we're in a little easier position because the fabrics, the threads that bind the two fabrics together are a contrast. There are some fabrics where everything is the same color. That's a little harder to see. That's why I chose this particular fabric as my example. Now what I'm doing here is I'm splitting it down to that thread basting, and that is why I put the thread basting in place, so that when I get down to where I need to, I can see on the inside that I have gone far enough. Now what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to trim this down just a little more, then I will go off camera because this is like watching paint dry. But you can see, you give it a pull and you cut the threads. No other way around this that I know of. So yeah, and then there we are. We're down to the thread basting. So I will go off camera and finish this and bring it back and show you the results. Almost done. This is like watching paint dry, but in a way it's oddly soothing. Sorry about that. Okay, so now you can see the orange threads. We've gone down to where we need to. Now, I'm just going to lay it next to this one here. See how this is kind of ripply and this is flat? Once you're finished, you're going to take it over to the pressing table and press this flat, because you're going to get a little bit of stretch here, so you want to get it all back in shape before we continue. So I will take this back to the pressing table and give it a press and bring back the results. Now we can proceed with the classic seam. Since this classic seam makes for garments that are pretty much reversible, you want to decide which face is going to be on the outside. I'm going to use the plaid side, and the solid color side will be the inside. So what you want to do here is put these right sides together, and you're just going to pin these two and attempt to match that plaid. So the seam allowance on this is going to be 1/2 inch. We're going to sew it at 1/2 inch when we go to the machine, and then we'll press. But it's good to pin it first, like so. That's what it looks like on one side and on the other. You don't want to catch either of the backside pieces. So we'll go to the machine and we will sew this. At the machine, we will sew this seam at 1/2 inch. With just a standard 2.5 stitch. Fairly straightforward. That's what it looks like from this side and from this side. Our next step will be going to the pressing table. Before we press the seam open, we want to press it as sewn. And then, using a seam roll, just want to get these two out of the way. We just want to press this seam open. And then finally, going to bring this up and over. Now I would use a pressing cloth if I were doing this for real, but since this is a sample, I won't. So we turn these two seam allowances back so that the folded edges meet. And when we go back to the work table, we will slip stitch these two folded edges together to finish the seam. And so now it's just a slip stitch. What I would say is don't pull the stitch so tightly that it makes the seam wavy. You want it secure, but you don't want it to ripple. Okay, here we are, almost done. Back that off. So now let's just secure that thread, and then we'll have a look at the results. So there, that is the seam. The next thing you want to do, of course, is remove the basting and give it one more press, which I will do. I will bring it back and show you the results. So here we have it. A seam that looks pretty much the same from both sides. You can see you have a little bit of bulk in here. You can't get away with that. You have two sets of seam allowances in there. But for an unlined garment, this is the ticket. Next is what's called the inset seam. This is what it looks like. How it differs from the classic seam is in the distribution of seam allowances. You can see in the classic seam on the left, the seam allowances are divided equally between the two stitching lines. In the inset seam on the right, they fall to one side. So it gives somewhat of a top stitch look, or like a flat fell seam. But be aware of the effect on this. The other advantage that the inset seam has is that you only have to split one side, so it's less labor intensive. The inset seam is a lot less labor intensive because you're only going to split one side. The other one does not split. So how this works is we're pinning one layer of one side and both layers of the other side together. Now what this will do is it will put all of the seam allowances on one side, but that's okay. That's what you're going for. Most clothes that you see these days will be made with this one because it is, like I said, less labor intensive. You don't have to split as much of the fabric. So now I have pinned these together, and we will go over to the machine and sew. We're ready to sew this. We're sewing 3 of the 4 layers at 1/2 inch with the standard 2.5 stitch. And you notice here I have my pins running crosswise. That is so I can get these 2 plaids to match. You could either do that or you could baste. Normally if I was making a garment with the plaid, I would definitely baste it so that it all matches. But for sample, no. thread. Let's show you the results. There is one side, there is the other, and yay, they match pretty much. Next, we go to the pressing table. Our first step is to press as sewn. Then we put the seam roll on, and we press these seam allowances towards this one here. Then finally, I'm going to lay this flat, it's a little easier to see. Finally, I'm going to bring this, fold it, and you want to press it so that this folded edge covers your stitching. Now I would use a pressing cloth, as I said before, but since this is a sample, no. So this is pressed and ready for finishing. Back to the work table. And as with the last one, we sew with the slip stitch. You don't want this to show on the front, so you're just going to catch the fold and then just catch the back cloth. And again, you want the tension to be snug enough so that it holds everything smoothly, but you don't want to pull it so tightly that it's going to create ripples. Almost finished. Let me just tie that off. There we are. So to show you the results here, you don't see the machine stitching that sewed everything down. And here is the face. Now I'm just going to remove the basting while I have it here. And so there you have it. I will give this a press and bring it back here so you can inspect the results. And there you have it, the finished seam. Now what you can see here is that all of the seam allowances fall to one side. That's why they call this the inset seam. You're insetting one panel into the other. It gives it a little different look than the classic seam, but this is the inset seam. There are two edge finishes for double cloth. First is the classic edge. The second is the bound edge. Let's give you a closer look here. This is the classic edge. You can see that the two layers are just turned and slip stitched to finish. The bound edge, one of the layers is trimmed away and the other layer comes up and over, concealing the raw edge of the first. We have a lot to do, so let's get busy. For the two hems, I have worked ahead and split the fabric in the same manner as I did for the two seams. These will take place primarily at the pressing table. The classic edge begins after pressing everything flat. You will first roll one layer in so that the cut edge is just inside where the two fabrics meet. So this will be a 1/2 inch. So that's what it looks like when we're pressing. Then we will turn it over and press the other side the same way. To finish, we will put the two edges together, give it one more press, and we will take this all back to the work table to hand finish. This is a simple matter of a slip stitch. And as in the others, you don't want to pull this stitch too tightly. You don't want to make it wobble. You want it secure enough so that it holds the edges together, but yeah, not too tight on your thread tension. Okay, let's tie this off. And look at the results. So there you have it on one side and then the other. So our final step really is going to be removing the basting and pressing. I will bring this back from the pressing table to show you the finished result. Once it's pressed, it makes a nice, thin, flexible edge. And that is how you make the classic edge finish with double cloth. The bound edge starts a little differently than the classic edge. What we want to do first is to trim away this side right close to the stitching. So that will be what we have. Then press this in. Now, I'm going to press it first and then show you. We press this back, but we leave 1/8 of an inch or so. So you can see here, you have a little bit of a gap between the two cut edges. You need that because if you put them exactly together, you get a buckle. So once you have that pressed, you can press this up. And we will take this back to the work table for finishing. To finish the bound edge, again, it's a slip stitch. You're catching just one layer of the fabric. You don't want this to show from the front. Now, something to know is with this particular edge, you're losing about a 1/2 inch of height, so you want to factor that into your design. And you notice I like to sew with a double thread. I just find it's stronger, and you don't have to worry about the thread coming out of the needle, which is so annoying. So again, the tension, not too tight, not too loose. You don't want to pull it so much that it makes a ripple. And this creates the illusion of a bound edge. So when you're designing with this, I would have this on the outside. Why would you go through all this work and have it be on the inside? So here we are. That's what it looks like from the front. That's what it looks like from the back. I will take out the hand basting and give it a press and bring you back the results. And the result. This is the front. This is the back. Notice you don't see any of the stitching on the back. That's as it should be. For this particular seam, we are actually using two of the classic finish for the edges. And what I've done in the back is I whip stitched them together. That will make it so that the seams hold together so that we can sew on this side. Now that we've prepared our sample, let's talk a moment about needles. As you can see here, these are called milliner's needles. They are by Clover. Other companies make them. What I like about these needles is that there is very little flare at the eye, because you'll see in a little bit when we make the stitches, you don't want there to be too much of a flare at the eye of the needle, because that is going to cause a traffic jam when we try to make this stitch. I am using 3 plies of the embroidery floss in my needle. So I will go off camera, thread the needle, and we will begin. So you can see I have the needle threaded up with embroidery floss, 3 plies. Now this may sound persnickety, but do it. Press it under the iron before you start sewing. So I want to anchor the thread here. And then I'm going to come directly across and catch the other edge. And so then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So you don't want to wrap those too tightly. But see, right in here, this is where where it'll make sense. You don't want that eye to be too wide, because that has to slide through this mass on the shank of the needle. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to hold it between index finger and thumb and slip the needle through everything, and then draw this down tight. Now see how it's kind of folding over? What you want to do then is bring the needle back in there and travel over to where the next stitch is going to be. There you have it. Now we turn it over, because it's just easier, and then you're going to repeat. So again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You can make that a little longer or shorter, but I find that 9, it's a good number. So then again, slip this needle through, and then jump across to the next side. And what you can do here, if you need to, is you can tease that out a little bit so that it all distributes. So then again, bullion knot. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now you see, this is why those Ralph Rucci suspension coats are so expensive, because they have to tie the entire coat together with these little tiny knots. So now you know. I'm going to work all the way across, And what you'll find is the more you do it, the more even they will be. But I will work this all the way across and bring back the results. So here is the result. Our next step will be removing the basting and a little bit of a press, which I will do off camera, and I will bring back the finished sample. We're all pressed, and this is what it looks like from behind. So the bullion knots actually are holding the seam together. And now you know how to do it.